This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is Schoolhouse Rock, the 3-minute segments for kids that is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. And I have Paul Ringel with me to talk a bit about the history of it. Paul Ringel is my guest. He's written about Schoolhouse Rock, the children's animated shorts that were popular in the 1970s and 80s. We'll be talking about the history of them as it's been 50 years since they were on. Before I get into that, though, what I usually like to do is give my guests a few minutes to tell about who they are. So welcome, Paul. If you could tell me a little bit of your own personal background, the book that you wrote about Schoolhouse Rock, and some opening volleys.
Sure. So I am originally from a suburb of Boston, Massachusetts, and I did my grad work at Brandeis. I got a PhD there back in 2005 and wrote a book called Commercializing Childhood, which is about the history of children's magazines in the 1800s and early 1900s and how they trained kids to become consumers. And as I was sort of looking around for different projects after that book was done, a bunch of my friends kept telling me, "Oh, you're a historian. We love all the history excerpts from Schoolhouse Rock." And I started to think, well, maybe there's something there to look at. You know, how did they do their history, and how would that be relevant to the way we're teaching history today? So I did. I haven't written a book yet, although it's actually going to be, Schoolhouse Rock is going to be a chapter in a book that I'm handing in next summer that'll come out in 2025 about how corporations and entertainment industries have taught children American history through entertainment. But I did write a journal article, and then I wrote a piece for the Washington Post after that journal article about the history of Schoolhouse Rock and why it matters now.
Yeah, I did a show a few years ago on the decline of Saturday morning television. And it's interesting because the 1980s, Schoolhouse Rock started in 73, and several iterations went for, I guess, about 15 or so years. But the 1980s, to me, seemed to be the death knell for cartoons. You had all of those Thundercats and He-Man and the My Pony and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. all these basically cartoons that were basically just glorified ads for dolls and stuff like that. Do you think that Schoolhouse Rock was sort of the last gasp of anything that was even remotely creative or intelligent in terms of cartoons for kids, at least on TV?
I don't think it was the last gasp, but it is very much a part of the 70s boom of Saturday morning. And I don't know how old you are, but that's what I grew up with. I grew up with, I was born in 1968, so I grew up with the 70s boom of kids TV and, Super Friends and Scooby-Doo and all of that stuff. And Schoolhouse Rock came into existence because the networks were getting a lot of heat about how commercial their Saturday morning television was and how much it lacked education, and especially how much violence there was. And that really started after the assassinations of Dr. King and Robert Kennedy in 1968. You have this group called Action for Children's Television that starts pushing for FCC regulation. And this is a pattern with children's culture that goes back to the comics in the 50s and everything, that whenever the government threatens to step in, the industries say, "Oh, no, we'll regulate ourselves." And so they tried to create more educational TV. They tried to create shows to go with all the regular shows that were educational. And around 70 and 71, they put out this wave of shows that were at least partially educational. The only one that stuck was Fat Albert. Fat Albert was part of that wave, but the other shows are shows that you've never heard of, and I've forgotten the names of them off the top of my head now. But they basically, other than Fat Albert, were really unsuccessful. But what they figured out worked better and got the regulators off their backs was doing what they called interstitial programming, which was this kind of 3-minute stuff that they put in between the shows. So they started within the news. I don't know if you remember that. So they'd have little,
and the
exactly,
turning.
And they'd have the little, and that ran for about 15 years on CBS. And ABC discovered that they could do these Schoolhouse Rock episodes and use them to help get the sponsors and get the parents and the regulators off their backs. So I don't know if it's the last creative thing. I mean, we can talk about shows like Liberty's Kids, which I think, now that's not Saturday morning, that's PBS. But, and I worked on a show called Time Warp Trio that was on Discovery Kids and PBS back in the early 2000s. But it was definitely part of that kind of boom time of Saturday morning TV in the 70s.
Yeah, I mean, PBS too had some quality shows other than obviously Sesame Street. There was Electric Company with Rita Moreno and the big tall black fellow. Morgan Freeman was the dude.
Yep. And Mr. Rogers was that same time period too.
Right.
And one of the arguments I make in my article is they all kind of come out of that same impulse, that the Sesame Street people and the Schoolhouse Rock people were all from that kind of cultural, educational community in New York in the mid-'60s, but Sesame Street veers in one direction and Schoolhouse Rock veers in another.
Well, yeah, and that aired on commercial TV, Schoolhouse Rock, even though it was educational. Yeah, and you have to remember, too, because I do have you by 3 years. I was born in 65. You know, you had basically those terrible Hanna-Barbera cartoons.
Yep.
And usually they'd run a year or so. You'd have like Josie and the Pussycats, then they went to outer space, and then you had like the Flintstones, I think it was the Pebbles and Bam Bam show. Or you'd have the live Croft shows with like Jim Neighbor.
What was that one with the crazy psychedelic animals?
There's H.R. Puff and stuff.
That's what I meant, yeah.
H.R. Puff and stuff, and then they tried their own version of the monkeys with some British insects or something.
I don't even know that one.
About the only quality thing I think from the Croft brothers was what Land of the Lost. That was semi-sci-fi, quasi-scientific, where they would maybe mention things about like a pocket universe or something. It was a little bit better, but and also one other thing that wasn't. It was sometimes on commercial television. Now was Big Blue Marble. I remember that was a show that was put out by ITT. And that was another quality show. But mostly it was just a lot of the crap there. So was it ABC itself? Was Schoolhouse Rock commissioned by or owned by ABC?
So it wasn't exactly commissioned. It was created by this advertising agency. The head of the agency was a guy named David McCall. And I don't know if this story is true, but this is the origin story that they always tell. So he was the head of a big advertising agency. I think it was like McCullough and McCall or something like that. And he was supposedly out on a dude ranch with his family on a vacation. And he had this kid, his son, who was in middle school, who was struggling with math. And he noticed that his kid couldn't remember the basic math stuff, but that he was riding along on the horses and singing all the Rolling Stones lyrics. And so he came up with this idea there that we should do music to help kids learn math. And they started by doing an LP. Before they did the show, they did an LP of songs. And they hired Bob Doro, who was the main songwriter for Schoolhouse Rock and was a pretty well-respected jazz musician in New York at the time.
And was he the guy who did Conjunction Junction? He had that.
Yeah, he did most of the songs, not all of them, but he was the guy they commissioned first. Yeah. And they made an album of math songs because the first season of Schoolhouse Rock is all math.
Yeah.
And it started from this math album, and they took it to Bank Street School in New York City, which was a place, it's still a place, uptown in New York, where they do a lot of training of teachers for public schools in New York. And they had them try it out in various schools in New York City, and it kind of, the teachers loved it, and the kids loved it. And so one of McCullough and McCall's biggest clients was ABC. And ABC was looking for stuff to do to get the regulators off their back. And McCall brought this to them and said, hey, I've got this project that I've been working on. What do you think about doing this? And ABC bought it. So ABC bought it. ABC owns, now Disney owns the right to the name Schoolhouse Rock. but it was created through this advertising agency.
Now, I do know that there was, in just thinking as you were speaking, I think ABC also did the equivalent of the the primetime movie of the week kind of thing. Because I remember they did some cartoons that one was a profile of Willie Mays, who was retiring at the time. They did a few other ones about historic figures. They threw in their own Fred Flintstone here or there, but it was. Did that was there any linkage between that? Maybe not financially, but was ABC of the three major networks at the time, were they taking the lead in getting ahead of the government with things like these profiles of athletes or the Schoolhouse Rock?
I don't. Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't mean to interrupt, but I don't know those movies that you're
Okay.
talking about. I'll have to go look them up because I'm curious. But I don't know that. I mean, CBS was doing In the News, and so ABC had to come up with its own thing. And I don't know that I'd say that they were kind of on the cutting edge or anything,
Uh-huh.
but they were. And I don't know what NBC was doing.
Yeah, I was going to ask.
But I think this kind of fell in ABC's laps. I don't think they were because, like I said, they were all trying to do programming, and it mostly wasn't successful. And I think that when David McCall brought this to ABC, they were just thrilled and just ran with it. But he said, and if you're interested, or if any of your listeners are interested, there's a really cool YouTube clip where a bunch of the David McCall died in a car accident in, I want to say, the early 80s or so. But the surviving guys in the 90s did an interview with the Paley Center in Los Angeles, which does a lot of history of television stuff. Mm-hmm. So if you type in Schoolhouse Rock Paley Center, there's a really cool, like, 45 or 60-minute interview with a lot. Most of them are gone now. Yeah. They've all died, except for one who's like 95 years old. And I reached out to him multiple times to try to get to him to talk to me, and I never heard back from him. Mm-hmm. So, but so I don't know that what they said in the interview was they didn't really get any funding. They did it all on kind of a shoestring budget. They went to textbooks to try to learn the content, which was fine with when you were doing math and grammar, but didn't work so well when you were doing history. Yeah. So I don't know that I'd say that ABC was on the cutting edge or anything, but they were just lucky to have this drop in their laps.
So did the writers like Doro, and we'll talk about some of the others in a moment, did they get to... did they file with, I guess it's ASCAP? Do they own the songs, or is it all Disney? They works for.
I don't know the answer to that, actually. Yeah. I don't know whether Doro and Tom Yohe and some of the other people who are involved. My guess is they were doing that as employees of McCullough and McCall, and I don't know. David McCall said, as I said, died, and McCullough and McCall doesn't exist anymore. So I didn't try to follow the train of ownership. I know that Disney owns the IP to Schoolhouse Rock, but I don't know who owns the specific songs.
So who were other than Doro, there was a female singer who was probably the female singer for 90% of, at least of the early ones. Who are the 2 or 3 main other people other than Doro who are the creative force?
So there's Blossom Dearie, who's a pretty, I thought that was a made up name, and it's probably a stage name, but she actually was a jazz singer in New York in the 70s, and she wrote a bunch of the songs. And then there's another woman, Esra Mohawk, Essra Mohawk, who wrote Suffer Until Suffrage and some of the other ones. But it was mostly Doro and Dearie who wrote the songs. Mm. And the ad guys did the animation. And George Newell and the guys who worked, David McCall's executives, they were the ones who did the animation.
They were simple, but they weren't simple in the way like Filmation was.
Right.
Who do we know what studio was contracted to do that?
I don't know. So, it was whoever they had on contract, probably.
So let's talk then about the first season, and that's all the math. It looks like it's the first 12 digits. It looks like number 1 is the only one of the first 12 digits that didn't get its own video.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think that's right, though. Multiplication Rock was the first season, and they had, 3 as a magic number, and a whole bunch of figure 8 I used some of those with my own kids who are now teenagers, but when they were learning their multiplication, we used the Schoolhouse Rock to help them.
Now, do you know or have you read? Were there any ways that the songs? I mean, they're different. Different. They have different beats. Some are more jazzy. Some one like the later Verb is very of the time. The black cinema. It has that very funkadelic kind of sound. Was there a formula in any way that some of these early most memorable ones were created, or was it just the individuals just tossed ideas around?
So from what I've heard, and I tried to look that up, and all I could find was some of the interviews that were done with Bob Dorough and Blossom Dearie, because they both passed away. And it seems like it was just kind of individual inspiration of the songwriters that they tried to mix it up a little bit, and they both came from jazz backgrounds, and they just kind of went with their own inspirations.
Now, I want to talk about some of the individual ones, but I just want to talk about the whole arc of the series here, because '73 was multiplication. The next season we got grammar rock. Then it was America rock.
Yeah, and that's the one I really focus on.
Yeah, and then we had and then after those first three, it seems to me maybe because I was getting a little bit older. But the songs got a little bit more tired, and they seemed a little bit more forced. We had science rock, we had computer rock, which I barely remember. Money rock.
Yeah, it also got a little more sporadic because what they did, and young people now don't know the concept of reruns, right? But it's part of the reason why these songs are so ingrained in our heads, and all the 50-something folks like us can sing these songs is because they just played them over and over and over and over and over again. And so after the first three seasons, it got more sporadic. And then actually when Reagan got elected in 1980, all of the pressure to produce educational television on Saturday morning kind of went away, and he kind of took the FCC off the track. And so they stopped kind of bothering after 1981, even though Schoolhouse Rock won all these Emmys and it was getting all these awards and critical acclaim, and the kids loved them. They basically made the three main seasons, and then it kind of sputtered out over time. And then I think they tried to bring back like environmental rock or something later on, but it's never really gone nearly as well as it did those first three seasons.
Well, for anyone listening, or for you, if you're a Ronald Reagan fan, that God bless. But for me, that Reagan's election to me is when this country, in so many areas, started to slide. So let's talk about the first episode. I mean, 3 is a magic number. That has a very, I don't know if you remember, there was a show, The Courtship of Eddie's Father, on a few years before.
I remember. I'm a little too young for that, but I remember seeing some of the reruns, but I don't remember much about it.
The song has very much the same feel as the theme song from that show. My Hero Zero is one of the catchiest of all of the songs. My Hero Zero, and a lot of people like the little boy with the puffed up chest. That one's good. Elementary, My Dear, I remember that's the one that's based on Noah's Ark, I believe. The Four-Leg Zoo is a little bit more jazzy. Ready or Not, Here I Come. That's the one the guy's counting on his fingers, and the kid has several hands. The kid's behind him. Ready or Not. Then I got 6. There we sort of get into the more overtly what I guess you'd call funky kind of music. And it's, I think the first one set in an urban setting. Lucky 7, Samson is a cute little song. Figure 8, I think, is one of the more underrated songs there. Naughty Number 9, again, is a bit more urban sounding. The Good 11 and Little 12 Toes is sort of a thing. What one or two stands out to you in that first batch of songs, or
probably
the videos?
3 is a magic number and Figure 8. And I don't know how much that is what I remember from the time or the subsequent way that those songs passed through my life, that three is a magic number. I'm a big De La Soul fan, and so when they used the sample from Three is a Magic Number in the '90s, that kind of got re-imprinted on me. And it is really interesting how, and I mentioned this briefly in my writing about how hip hop really took to Schoolhouse Rock and used samples. I don't know how much of a hip hop guy you are, but I'm a big De La Soul fan, and so that one really kind of has a constant place in my life, and my kids have developed a love for De La Soul too. So that's kind of a constant in our house. So I don't know how much that is from my childhood or from the subsequent. And then figure eight, my kids had a lot of trouble with the sevens and the eights when they were learning the multiplication tables. And so somehow figure eight really caught their eye and really helped them to remember their eight tables. But I don't know if that's so much what I remember as a kid or what came to me later in life.
And I'm just looking here. It looks like it says Capitol Records in 1973 released a soundtrack, and they released longer versions of some of the songs rather than just the 3-minute versions. Do you know anything about the longer versions?
No, I don't know. I knew there was a record. I didn't know there were longer versions, but now I'm going to have to go check that out.
I wonder if there's like an Inagata-Devita length, Three is a Magic Number, it just breaks into some guitar solo for 7 minutes.
Going crazy with his, he's a piano guy, so it might be more like I don't know, but I don't know, maybe an Emerson, Lake and Palmer kind of extended organ solo or something. Yeah. I'm not sure, but no, I don't know anything about that.
So the second season was in the fall of '73. And we get Grammar Rock, and that's another one that is just really rife with a lot of memorable songs.
Maybe the most, I think, of all the songs. I think that might be the season that had kind of the most resonance.
So we have Nouns, a person, place, a thing. Lynn Aaron. So that wasn't Blossom Dearie. Verb was sung by someone named Zachary Sanders. As an urban kid, I loved that. That was probably my favorite one. I think it's a great song. It reminded me of the blaxploitation films and.
Well, that's the right time period, right? Yeah. So there may very well be something to that.
Yeah, and he hits the home run or something, and Conjunction Junction. Now, why do you think Conjunction Junction? If we talk about them. Like I said, now Verb, Nouns, a person, place, a thing, some of the number ones. But probably, I think, if you ask anyone who was in that age range that we are in, probably Conjunction Junction and, it just slipped my mind.
I'm Just a Bill.
I'm Just a Bill. Those are probably the two most famous ones. Why do you think they stick out? Because they're good, solid songs, but I don't think they're quite artistically up to some of the others, but yet they seem to be 1 and 2.
Well, I'm not sure about Conjunction Junction, but I'm Just a Bill, I think, just because it has so many political references, many political possibilities, right? It's been replayed in so many different things, everybody from like Jimmy Kimmel to The Simpsons to Saturday Night Live to I have a friend in Georgia. When Stacey Abrams was running Turn Georgia Blue in 2020, he did a spoof on I'm Just a Bill for the Turn Georgia Blue campaign. So it keeps coming up, and I think because of the political resonance of it, everybody knows that one. Yeah. And Conjunction Junction, I don't know if it's one of the best. My favorite of that season is probably Interjection.
Yeah, but, I was going to say that's mine too. That and Verb.
But I don't know. It just keeps. I think it was that rerun thing, and I don't know. I don't have data on how often they were rerun, but I feel like Conjunction Junction was running all the time through my Saturday morning childhood when I was like 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. But you're right. I don't think they're necessarily any better than other songs. But I agree that those two, and maybe the preamble to the Constitution.
I can still know the whole preamble because of it.
I can too. And what's amazing is kids, my teenagers and their generation can do it too, because teachers use that still. And there's been so much. I mean, we may not want to get into this now. You may want to do it later. But this series has such a tale from the DVDs that were released in the 90s to the alternative rock soundtrack that came out with like Pavement and the Lemonheads doing remakes of these songs in the 90s to that now they're on Disney, and my daughter's a theater kid, and there's a middle school theater show of Schoolhouse Rock where these kids still have such exposure to these songs 50 years on that I mean,
well, I wonder if it's something about the 70s too, because I know the Brady Bunch was turned into a stage play too. The Marsha, 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 what you get said with the football. There seemed to be something about the 1970s that I don't know, maybe something that stuck in the psyche. Maybe it was because the kids post-boomer were just hitting it right. The 70s seemed to be perfect. You had that 70s show 25 years ago.
And what's the Linklater movie set in Texas? Dazed and Confused.
Yeah. I don't know. You said Esra Mohawk, so that she sang, that's a female that sang Interjections, right? Esra?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a female.
Yeah.
And she did Suffer Until Suffrage too, I think. I'm not sure.
That's another rockin' one. Unpack your adjectives, lolly, 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 adverbs.
Yeah, I think quality-wise, that's my favorite season.
Oh yeah. And then Rufus Xavier Sarsaparilla. That's another catchy one. Busy prepositions. The tale of Mr. Morton. Now that's one. Yeah, that was my wife's favorite one. The Tale of Mr. Morton for some reason. And so busy prepositions, the busy piece, Helen will produce for Schoolhouse Rock return. No wonder that was 93. So they were added on to, but stuck in there. That's why my wife, because my wife's
I don't remember busy prepositions, so that's why, because it's they did some add-ons. They did one. There's an interesting one. I know we're going to get to History Rock, but there's one about Three Ring Circus, about the three branches of government that was made in the 70s, but they put it on the shelf because they were afraid that people were going to get mad about them satirizing the government. So, some of them,
the way it's gone now, it's self-satire. It's making itself. But anyway,
exactly.
So then the third season was a couple of years later. It's in '75, and that's was called America Rock. And I remember because we were heading right into the bicentennial that they produced a lot of them. And like I said, I would have been, 75 would have been 10. I have to say, even I knew some of this stuff was a bit dicey. You got a celebration of Manifest Destiny. There's very little talk of the Middle Passage. We don't hear anything about Jim Crow or lynching. We do get the suffrage movement, which is I think one of the better ones in that. But talk a little bit before we hit the individual ones about the problems and stuff, especially in the last 20 years or so. People have been much more critical of this third season.
Yeah, well, I mean, they don't really deal with race at all. And what's interesting is they made a really intentional point of making the kids on the screen very diverse, but the content of the material is just the opposite. Yeah. So they do things like in No More Kings, they go straight from Plymouth to the Revolution, and they don't even mention Virginia because they don't mention anything about slavery at all. There's no mention of race, no mention of slavery. The only time we see Native Americans is when we see them hiding behind the rock when they first bump into Plymouth Rock. And so they really just ignore these issues. And I think the reason why is we're in this period where there's only 3 networks, right? And then there's like these secondary stations, but it's not all divided up the way that we are now with like 80 gazillion stations. So you have to pitch to a mass audience, and they're doing this in the post-Watergate, pre-bicentennial moment when people don't want to hear the bad things anymore.
It's also a couple of years before Roots, the miniseries.
Right. But at this point, they're really working, they're bending over backwards not to deal with any of the contentious issues. And what I think is really interesting is this is happening while the Black Studies movement and the women's studies movement and the Native American studies movements are exploding all over college campuses. And none of these guys were historians. Yeah. So they went to textbooks, but the problem was, I don't know exactly what textbooks they used. I tried to figure it out and I couldn't, but they're using the kind of history that kids were taught in the 50s.
Yeah.
Which we call in the trade, we call it consensus history, which is we're all more alike than different, and disputes in our past are all overrated. And so they really take that approach at a time when just the opposite is happening in the country, right? I mean, we're just getting out of Vietnam. Go ahead.
Well, to be fair, like my parents were born in 1916 and 1922. If you went back to the textbooks of the 30s, you would still have people being called Negroes and Negresses and stuff. So those, by the time you got to the 50s, the Ike era, they were trying to be enlightened. They just, I don't think, knew how to do it. It's the kind of thing like where people say, I don't see race, and now a black person will say, well, you don't even see that I'm a different color, when the intention might be good, but it's just done wrongly.
But there are textbooks and historians in the 30s really trying to deal with some of because the 30s is a very contentious time, right? With the Depression, and is market capitalism really going to survive? Is it the best thing for us to use? This is the time period where all the people who got in trouble for communism in the 1950s, this is the period in the 30s when they were dabbling with it. So it's not a kind of a straight line that the 30s were bad, the 50s were a little better. It kind of goes up and down. Yeah. And so the 50s school books were really focused on making sure we focused on the positive. This is the time of McCarthy, right? This is the time where people were getting scared. It's kind of like what we're in now, where people are scared to rock the boat, and you could get in real trouble if you put in any kind of critical material.
And that brings up the obvious question, I think, is that since these were being aired on one of the three major networks, and you're coming off of 2 seasons of critical and artistic acclaim for both the songs and the cartoons, for math and for math and grammar, it seems to me that if they had even tried, even if they had the information, and let's say, you're not going to really do a Trail of Tears video with a song, because imagine what Congress would have come, even forget Congress nowadays, even the more liberal, let's say, Congress of the 70s in the Watergate era, trying to say, we're trying to get the country back together. If you're doing the Trail of Tears or showing Andrew Jackson, having an Indian scalp on him, it's not exactly going to go over well.
Well, it's not even Congress. I think what they're more concerned about is the viewers, right? People are not going to, and the white audience that they were, the 70s is the time when they're just starting to realize, hey, there are black audiences, right? Shows like the Jeffersons and Good Times and things like that. But for the children's stuff, it's pushed toward a white audience, and they're afraid that they're going to alienate people. And the whole, it's different when you're dealing with multiplication or grammar, which is, you're teaching facts, versus history where you're teaching interpretation. And everything they did was like bend over backwards to not offend anybody.
Yeah. Now I want to talk about No More Kings, because that has been singled out, and I think justly, for some of its historical inaccuracies. But you mentioned that the gay rights movement. I think King George is shown as being a bit fey. He has the purple lips and he's dingling his fingers or something. It's almost as if we're saying, we're rough, hardy Americans, and they're the fey, effeminate Brits.
Yep. And they can kind of sneak that in because they're not making a statement. But yeah, absolutely, that's
well,
the case.
It's not in the song. It's the cartoonist.
No, it's in the image. Yeah, right.
Then the shot heard round the world. So let's go through them, and you sort of narrate any commentary that was negative about it. The shot heard round the world. What's the one or two things, if anything, that's sketchy there?
I don't think Shot Heard Round the World is as sketchy as No More Kings, which, as I said, completely ignores the issue of race. The thing with Shot Heard Around the World, and this is one of the issues I have with the third season as a whole, is they make it all just look so easy, right? Like, we're going to fire a shot and boom, we're going to turn around and the British are just going to march into the sea and we'll be done with it. And so in like Suffering Toward Suffrage, there's a line that says, they carried signs and marched in lines until the law was passed. And it makes it sound like it all happened in like 6 months, whereas the women's suffrage movement took 80 years. Yeah. So my biggest problem with Shot Heard Around the World is they just make it sound like we snapped our fingers, the British ran away, and it was over.
Yeah, it's sort of like History for Dummies.
Right.
So then we had the preamble, and that one I guess is rather straightforward. I don't recall it there being anything because it's basically just a recitation of the words in the preamble.
Well, the only thing about the preamble that's interesting is they have, and not in the language, because you're right, the language is just the preamble of the Constitution, but in the images, they have all these images of people in jury boxes, and maybe I'm getting them mixed up, but I think off the top of my head it's the preamble, that like they have black men and white women sitting in jury boxes, which none of that happened in the 1780s, right? Yeah. And they're making it seem like everybody's included where that wasn't the case. But the language is, you're right, just the preamble of the Constitution. And so the ones that I really have the bigger problems with are elbow room, melting pot, and mother necessity.
Well, yeah, let's talk about melting pots, since that's one. Now, the things there is, again, the simplification. All the little kids are jumping off a spoon into the melting pot. You can almost say it almost seems cannibalistic there if they had shown like black people boiling a pot with white people in it. But yeah, they ignore not only the most obvious, the middle passage, but they ignore Chinese that came here and were bigoted. They ignore anti-Semitism, the Jews. They ignore no blacks, no Irish, no whatever.
Yeah, they don't deal with any of that. In the pictures they have, again, this is a distinction between the pictures and words. So the pictures are very diverse, and they have Sikh children and Chinese American children, and but the story not only doesn't deal with any of those issues, but the one thing that gets me the most is if you look at, they talk about the recipe for the Great American Melting Pot, and this is, I'm even putting aside here the concept of the melting pot, which historians don't really use anymore and haven't for a long time, but they've got Lady Liberty with her recipe for the melting pot, and if you look at it, they have Poles and Armenians and Spaniards and Italians and whatever, but then they just have Africans. So they don't have Nigerians, Zimbabweans, Egyptians. It's just Africa's one big place. And so they don't deal with, as with all of these episodes, they don't really deal with any of the struggle. It's just like, hey, we just came over and everybody was good, and we all jumped into this saucepan and melted into this wonderful new culture.
Yeah. Now, Elbow Room, getting back to what I said about the Trail of Tears, Elbow Room is arguably, for me, maybe the one that's the most offensive, because the idea is they glorify manifest destiny. It's even the crescendo of the song. It was a manifest destiny.
Yeah. And it's interesting if you watch that YouTube video that I talked about from the Paley Center in the 90s. I don't remember whether it's Tommy Owie or George Newell. One of the writers said, we didn't even know there was anything wrong with the concept of manifest destiny when we wrote that song. So they're not historians. They don't have historical consultants working with them. They're just going from the textbooks. And the whole concept of, and I'm flapping my elbows here, that, it was all about white people needing more room. There's no, Native Americans. You see Sagajawe, I counted for 3 seconds in the 3-minute song. There's no Chinese immigrants. There's no Mexican immigrants. It's just all about the white Europeans heading north, and we need our elbow room, and there's nothing in our way, and there's no problem here at all. So I agree, that is probably the most problematic one.
But even if there had been historical consultants in 1975 or 76 at the bicentennial, would they really have objected that much, do you think, to a song like that?
The historians would have. I mean, historians were not making those arguments in 1975. But would they have listened to the historians? That's another question. But but the historians would have, any decent historian who they consulted in 1975 would have said, yeah, you can't do that. You can't completely ignore these other facets. But, you know, the question is, as someone who worked on a show myself, you know, they don't always listen to the historians. They take your advice and they smile and nod, and then sometimes they listen and sometimes they don't. But they didn't even know. They didn't even. I don't think they had any budget to hire historians to consult with them.
So before we get to Mother Necessity, the one right before it was Fireworks, and then it goes to a couple of ones that were made in this century, or Three Ring Government was 79. But Fireworks is the Declaration of Independence. I vaguely remember that one. Was there anything wrong with that?
That's not one that I worry about too much. The ones that really bug me are the three that I talked about: the Elbow Room, Great American Melting Pot, and Mother Necessity.
So what's the last one? What's the issues there?
So Mother Necessity has one of the worst moments in the whole season. You know, it's about inventors. And first of all, it's all white male inventors, of course. And they don't go in historical order, which wouldn't be necessarily a problem. But they start with Eli Whitney and the cotton gin.
Yeah.
And there's this scene where he's telling his grandmother about Eli Whitney. And there's these two men with kind of like afros, but it's not really clear whether they're black or white or mixed race, and they're just sort of happily, it's like the happy slave mentality, right?
Yeah.
So they're happily churning or ginning cotton, while this Colonel Sanders looking Southern plantation, literally he looks like Colonel Sanders, Southern plantation owner is looking over them. There's no mention of slavery, but they play Dixie in the background. If you listen to that moment, they're doing the do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do in the background while they're doing that. And there's no recognition, again, of any of the conflicts. I showed it to one of my friends who's a really good scholar of the civil rights movement, a little younger than us, but probably about late 40s or 50, and he remembered the songs. But when I showed him this, he was like, no, they didn't just do that, right? But they did. And so that is one of the moments that made me think, because I told you, right, that I went and people kept telling me, well, I remember my history from Schoolhouse Rock. And I was like, okay, I'm going to go back and watch these and see what they look like, because I didn't really remember the history ones. I actually used No More Kings when I was doing my interview for the job I have now. I had to teach a class, and I used No More Kings as the entryway into the conversation about the American Revolution and what the problems were. So I knew about that one, but I went and watched them. And when I watched Mother Necessity and Elbow Room, I was just like, no way. They didn't really... and that was when I knew I had to write about this stuff.
So it looks like the last of the seasons that were produced in, say, let's call the 1970s, the golden age of this was Science Rock, which, looking at it, the only two that come to my mind as being fairly memorable, The Victim of Gravity, because it had that 50s doo-wop sound, the 70s where you had Happy Days, Laverne and Shirley, Sha Na Na, so they were all obsessed with the 50s. And then probably for me, my favorite song there is Interplanet Janet,
That's another one.
Although science has left it by, as Pluto would not be included now.
Exactly.
But so were there any issues science-wise with Science Rock?
Well, I'm not a science educator, so I don't know. I mean, nothing that comes to my mind, but certainly the changes in the planetary analysis, and I have a kid who wants to be an astronomer, so she could probably tell you better than me. But I didn't really focus on the science ones because I don't pretend to be any kind of an expert on science or science education.
Yeah.
I even think that, other than Interplanet Janet, I think that's kind of beyond. I think those first three seasons are really the kind of the golden age, and you get little slivers afterwards. But I think that the first three seasons are really where Schoolhouse Rock makes its bones. And if you watch I told you they have that middle school show. if you watch the middle school show, I think Interplanet Janet is the only song they have from beyond the first 3 seasons.
Yeah. So after that, like I said, intermittent. They did a few here or there in the '80s, and then the latest one's actually early 21st century. But that by that time, Saturday morning was in the toilet.
Yeah.
So when did sort of the revival of this come out? Was it with the '90s hip hop stuff?
So I think the '90s is a big thing, not only with the hip hop stuff like De La Soul, but also the alternative album. I don't know what year it came out in the '90s, but it's all these, like I said, Lemonheads and Pavement. And
Yeah.
trying to remember who else. There's that album that came out, and I was, at that point, I was in my 20s, I guess, and I remember listening to that album for a while on repeat because it was such a nostalgia trip, and it was all these bands that I loved in my 20s, and I think there was that, but I don't know that it ever really went away. I mean, it went on VHS tapes, and then it went on DVDs. And if you look at how often it gets spoofed, I mean, Saturday Night Live spoofs it when it's new and fresh, and then it gets spoofed by everything from The Simpsons to Blackish to Jimmy Kimmel. It gets used in, like I said, De La Soul, and there's 2 or 3 others I can't remember off the top of my head. And then, so it went from VHS tapes to DVDs to now it's streaming. It was on Netflix for a while, and now it's on Disney because it's Disney IP, and it's just accessible. I'm sure it has peaks and valleys, but I don't really think it ever went away. I know people. I've had lots of people come up to me and when they hear about my Schoolhouse Rock thing, and it doesn't really matter if they're in their 50s, their 30s, or their teens. They all know what I'm talking about. Like, this isn't one of those things like Underdog or one of the '70s things that only people our age remember.
So I've read that they may be rebooting it for the 50th anniversary. Would that obviously that's not going to run on Saturday morning since there's no cartoons and it wouldn't hit the kids. I would assume if they're going to do that, this would be something released online. How would that work, and what would the subject matter be?
Well, I don't know whether I'd be curious if you could send me where you saw that they're going to reboot it. I mean, it makes sense if they would. I'm working with a team of people to do our own version. We can't do Schoolhouse Rock because Disney owns the IP. Yeah. But I'm working with a team of folks to do our own version where we try to deal with some of these issues, not necessarily Trail of Tears, like you said, that's a pretty hard one, but trying to deal with some of the issues that they didn't deal with. We have a grant proposal in to do 8 episodes on Black history that I'm working with a hip-hop artist and a filmmaker, a Black filmmaker, and we're trying to do some stuff to get kids and make sure that it's not necessarily Dr. King or Rosa Parks or even Malcolm X, but some of the stories that people don't know, and find ways to do it in a musical style that kids will connect with now, which is mostly hip hop, which fits with a Black history. But ideally what I'd like to do is do episodes on all different kinds, working class history, women's history, LGBTQ history, and then mash them all together and just call them American history and just do a more diverse version of what they did in 75, 76. I'd really like to try to do that for 26 with the 250th birthday of the country coming. I'm trying to find ways to get somebody to fund something like that and either sell it to Netflix or even do it on YouTube. I don't know. We're trying to figure out the finances of that, but I have a whole bunch of people who are interested in working on it with me.
I'm wondering because a lot of times, especially Disney, when they have a cartoon, they redo it with live action. I was wondering if it would be interesting to see if a live action version of some of the originals.
I mean, that's certainly a trend they're doing, right? I mean, I haven't seen the new Little Mermaid one, but I think part of the charm of Schoolhouse Rock is its animation.
Yeah.
And there's so much cool animation opportunities now that I think keeping it animated is the way to go. That's certainly the way we're trying to do it.
And I think too, probably it would be something inspired by rather than going back to the old formula, because then it just looks like, you look at like the thing I hate is like franchises in TV, franchises in movies. You don't want to have continuous Schoolhouse Rock franchise, but to be inspired by and go in a different direction.
Well, we'll call it something else because again, we don't have the IP, and I don't imagine Disney's going to want to work with us to do. We're not looking for everything to be critical. We want to celebrate accomplishment, but we also want to take a more complex approach. So, if Disney wants to work with us, then they if they see this video and they want to work with us, then you know where to find me. But High Point University. But we're figuring we're going to do something inspired by. I mean, the other thing that's really good is that kind of 3 to 5 minute video is what kids watch now, right?
Yeah.
TikTok's a little shorter, but that kind of viral short thing will work really well.
Yeah. Did you ever see the spoof cartoon I'm Just a Slave, which sort of deals with that? Yeah.
There's I'm Just a Slave. There's I'm Just I don't know. There's a bunch of them.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, people have done such creative stuff with it. But like you said, we're not trying to do an updated version of I'm Just a Bill or Mother Necessity. We want to take that approach, and there's really 2 things we want to do. One is we want to make it more representative and not just make it white history. But 2, we want to get people thinking about how change actually happens, right? It doesn't just you don't just point your gun at the British soldiers and they turn around. You don't just march with a sign and you get women's suffrage. It's about how long and how persistently people had to work for what they accomplished and what they got for themselves. So those are the things that we're trying to think about in the version that we're trying to do.
So even with all its flaws, though, I would still argue that at least the golden age '70s ones are still worthwhile and are great little bits of art. Yes, they have their problems, but I mean, how many television shows, how many movies from 60 years ago, are problem. Just look at what's the one with Gregory Peck?
Kill a Mockingbird.
Kill a Mockingbird. Even that, even though it has the right flavor, still you look at some of the scenes with the black people with their eyes cowed, and you can tell when it was. You can tell it had good intentions, but it's still of its era. So I would argue that that's the similar thing with Schoolhouse Rock. For whatever its flaws, overall, it had good intentions and oftentimes came up with some great tunes that educated.
I think especially the first 2 seasons. I think you can absolutely still use multiplication rock and grammar rock today. I know teachers, elementary school teachers, who are still using this stuff in their classrooms. The songs are amazing. I think it's one of the most successful instructional products of the last 200 years. If you think about how many people have seen these videos over the last 50 years, I don't think there are too many educational tools that have had the kind of coverage that Schoolhouse Rock has had over the last 50 years.
Yeah, and we the people in order to fly. And I remember that at the end, the last line, it's not do establish, not to, because a lot of people say to establish, but it's do with a D. And I remember that. I think
when they do civics, when they do I'm Just a Bill, I mean, it feels a little out of date given our current political situation, but still, I'm Just a Bill and preamble, I think, are both still very usable. That's how I judge it. Can we still use them in elementary school classrooms today? And I think that those 2 and grammar rock and multiplication rock are absolutely still really good stuff. And it's amazing how well they've lasted.
Well, I want to thank you for spending about an hour speaking about it. I will link to paulbringle.com, your website, for people who want to find out anything more. Is there anything before we end that you'd just like to add that we didn't touch on in this regard?
No, I think we covered it really well, and thank you for having me. This was fun, and I hope people like it.